So to start with, where does flow come from? Flow is a difference. First off, it's two things relating, maybe not things, two different actions relating, processes relating. And from that interaction, there's an exchange, and on the most fundamental level, we're talking about two different pressure cells. In, like, say, weather. You have a high pressure and a low pressure, you're going to get flow, current between them. I don't like using current as much. We will when we get to electricity, and that's another thing, a different kind of pressure, two different voltage differences to give us a current. And here we're starting electrostatically. We can also start magnetically. And the magnetic field just accelerates a current, but you don't have a current without a magnetic field either. So we get into scales and fractals there. But as far as just flow goes, I mean, on a physical level, we're talking about two different pressures, and pressures is the best word for it. We have different electrical pressures, different air pressures, different water pressures, and this movement is the interaction. Now let's talk about, or this difference is the interaction. On a story level, you could think of this as, two people, different people doing their own thing, and then how that relates to each other. It can get into us with communication and words, but it can also be on the level of, they don't even have to say, I have an interaction with my future generations through my actions. I'm interacting with them just as my ancestors are interacting with me. In habits we have, in ways we think. We get into some complex flows there. But you can just see then also, other persons in the world. A bird flies over, how I'm relating to that, being aware of it to then relate to it on all levels. So you're looking at the stories that arise in you, you're looking at the emotions that arise in you, your train of thought and how it changes, and you're really becoming a listener, a watcher of your own processes, and through that get a better idea of what you are interacting with. Because on many different levels, we don't fully understand the beings and the energies we're interacting with. And as you become more aware, you can see that. This is literally everything from your habits and the stories you tell yourself, the thoughts you have, to walking in the woods and how you're interacting with climbing the hill, or what you do to a tree that then determines its growth. Say in the garden, you pruning may cause something to flower more, and it's not a cause as much as a dance. Cause implies one way, but why did you pick that one? And two, when you, it's the whole, on a quantum level, you actually viewing something changes the way it moves and interacts. And a good example of this is birds. You can be listening, but you just moving in that space, they react to you. So their baseline is fundamentally different than if you're not there. How they sing, where they are, what they're doing. And so everything is like that, on all levels. But if we're talking about physical things, I like working a lot with water, to look at the flows that are happening, the different eddies, on a larger scale, where it's soaking into the land, what's moving it, what is it moving, it being water here, but how it is interacting with the landscape. It's not the land is causing the water to do this, or the water is making the land this way. It all happens together. Time, when you start interacting with time, this is a Carlos Castaneda thing, I'm almost 100% sure. When you start interacting with time is when you are in that space. It's not a linear time, it's a things arise together. So there's that, and we can get even more physical with it. So here we get to a core principle of flow, and that is its cyclical nature in time and space. Let's break those apart now. Something moving cyclical in time. You can think of the rain cycle. The whole view of the rain cycle happening all at once. Yes, you can see it as a snapshot if you took that big of a picture. You can also follow it through, it has to move a single drop, let's say, through time as it moves through this whole system. And so your perspective really determines the interaction, what's going on. They're both the water cycle, but your perspective in it changes to give you different pictures, to add time, to take it away. Because that's time, and that's your phasing. Your perspective there is how you're phasing your phase differences in a way. The perspective of a body of water, of like a lake, is different than the perspective of a droplet, which is different from the perspective of the water as a whole in this region. Now, you also have oscillations, and so you get into these different cycles. A lake will have turnover period. In a stream, you have the flow rate, and in trees, you have the sap movement and rate that has to do with the year and the sun and all these different things. And then we get into larger scales of the sun and its cyclical sunspot cycle, and how it regulates different weather patterns and interacts with our atmosphere from the ionosphere down to the troposphere, and then how, again, that of course we're interacting with plants now too. And even the planets affect the growth of plants and different bud size. We'll get into some as a future lesson or a future video. We'll talk about projective geometry and the different wavelengths when you're looking at these different buds, for instance, of an oak tree, and how it relates to the movement, distance, position of different planets, and each plant having different affinities in that sense. And then we can look at, and so those are cycles in time. Something's happening, then dissipating on that level, but at the same time on a larger, you can take it onto larger levels too, different perspectives, especially with water. Plants, not so much. They are set in more specific frequencies, you could say. But when we move into uh, these cycles in space, so here we're talking about a circle is a very simple one. It's super rare, and we tout it a lot. It is the perfected cycle in a way. But when you're moving and interacting with space, everything's moving, everything's cycling. So your cycle doesn't happen in isolation to create a circle. It happens in relation to a larger cycle. So in a body of moving water, you have, or let's just take it to start at the basics, eddies in water caused by turbulence. And what's happening here? You have an elongation you have a rotation around an X and Y axis, let's say, but you have an elongation around the Z axis, a movement there. And this can get incredibly, beautifully complex, and create some incredible interactions on multiple scales here, from galaxies to to the auroras in the northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere at the poles, to how different elements locate themselves in these, I'm going to call them temperature layers. What is temperature but levels of activity, you could say. And it is levels of activity on an atomic or molecular scale. And activity here being interaction. Every time we have movement, we have it in relation to something else. Nothing is just moving. It's all to fall into the lowest energy level in a way. And in doing so, it slips into the cycles of these larger, and it's not like it slips in there like it's out. It is already there. You cannot separate these. And we get into here just, so this is cycles in space. So we're talking about spirals, and then we also get cycles in time. And here we're talking about, and both have their perfection of the circle, but they're always happening in flow in relation to something else. So a cycle in time, the perfect circle there would be the universe. And I doubt it's a perfect circle. Though it's got to be the only perfect circle. Let's put it that way. Because it is infinity to a certain extent. A sphere in negative space is infinite. So that's another thing we get into. I think we'll save that for a later video of space and counter space, and the same with time. So we've kind of hit up on some two core principles, and then on one of those, so we have what causes flow, we have pressures. And then we have the flow itself, and it's an interaction of two different things. In more complex ways, you have a million different pressures. Think of a clouds in a way. Clouds are interesting because it's a water molecule that has a layer of negatively charged, so it's attracting a positive charge around it. Well, another water molecule has the same thing. The most positive charge is between them, so those are going to attract to each other because that's where most of the positive charge lies. So these two negatively charged bodies come in and get a certain distance before they equalize. And what is that? But the negative is pushing away just as much as the positive is pulling them together. And if they got close enough, they discharge, but they're always discharging in a way. That is why there's that difference there. we think of it like, oh, they're in stasis, and until they come together and discharge, then we're done. But they're always discharging, and that's the thing. That's what creates the movement, because as they discharge, they'll float back apart, and then that builds up again, and they float back together. There's dynamics here, but on a simple scale, which we'll try to stick to, but I'm not very good at. They are just coming together to a certain point and reaching equilibrium. Once you have equilibrium, you never do, because this is where flow happens. We have equilibrium in like batteries, or like, but even then you get discharge happening across the terminals, because a battery doesn't last forever. You still get charge leakage, which is good. That's how you get infinite energy. You tie into the systems around you. So, and we'll get into that too. I really enjoy that topic and thinking about those kind of things. Free energy, which, comes with its own stereotypes and ways of thinking. So you get into pressures. So it's going over our core principles here of pressures and then the flow. Once the pressures establish themselves, we have interaction. These two water molecules coming together closer and closer, we're having flow. We're having electrically, this is hard to describe, and I should look into this in more detail and present this in another video. With a high pressure and a low pressure cell in the weather, we have winds that are moving, interacting in these different areas, because that's what it is. These aren't static things. A water molecule is technically not really static. We take snapshots to represent pressure differences, or in time, but these are also processing. These are also happening in time. So you can't visualize it as, I have my water molecule here, and they're interacting. It's more like pressure cells in the weather, where you have flow coming in here, and it's leaving over here in a way. And that's what charge is. You don't have just a negative charge. It's negative in relation to its environment. If you put a single electron next to a group of electrons, the group of electrons is technically more negatively charged. So this little tiny electron is going to, I guess, dispel in a way. Because electrons are interacting too. We're not going there. So we get flow happening in these cells and weather cells, and because two things are moving in opposite directions, just taking something isolated, if I'm moving this way, there's a force moving against me, and I'm just exerting energy to walk in this direction. If I stop exerting energy, I stop. If you have two winds interacting, carrying bits of dust, this wind is a lot stronger, so I'm like maybe blowing into the wind. my air is coming out, but as it loses momentum, it blows back behind me. Well, this isn't just a simple mushroom shape, let's say. If I could blow that perfectly, that would be incredible. It's not just a simple mushroom shape that then moves behind me. It's a series of eddies as different points of my airstream interact with these different, and you get separate layer separation. Layers is the word I'm looking for. You get layers, so spikes come forward, almost like if you've watched clouds after a storm, they almost sometimes, not all the time, they almost seem like they're sagging, almost like bleh, bleh. That's that separation interaction, and one of them's giving way. And as I blow into the air, into the wind, you get pieces that everything's trying to move on the path of least resistance. It doesn't just slow down and then go backwards. It's actually rotating. Especially in larger streams, you get rotation. Why is it rotating? Because you have a force moving the opposite direction, or in a different direction. Let's put the force moving at 90 degrees. As my wind air comes and interacts with this stream of wind, it's going to rotate around as the stronger wind carries it. Does that make sense? You see these in, like, when someone tries to be fancy and does a time travel picture, or particle accelerator pictures, and it's just showing all these different spirals of different electrical interactions as they smash things together. It's kind of boring, really, when you can look at the weather or a stream and see the complex interactions that are happening there. As you get less flow, when these forces begin to align, these spirals, because they don't just end up straight next to each other like a grid, that's too perfect. It's sloppier than that. In that you get the stronger force pointing this way, but then you also have it pointing this way down here, and then it's pointing this way up here. So you get everything following it, and so you get these beautiful eddies. I don't know what else to call them. There was a time in Wyoming. Was it Wyoming? Snake River, I think it's called, in Wyoming. And there was a little weir, old, I don't know what it was used for, because it literally diverted stream water and then it popped right back in. Yes, it did. Either way, it was a weir that was like cracked or something. And the way the water came in and hit it, the rocks next to it to be diverted into it, it created this eddy right on the side where it's sticking into the main stream. So as the water came through and interacted with it, it caused this spiral. Well, it caught air, and it would pull air down in these long tubular pockets. And I mean, this is happening like, you can't just like, oh, it's sitting there in the water, but in a way it was. Everything's moving around it so quickly. The water's moving and it's gone like that. But it's creating a structure, it's creating a more complex organism in a way that's interacting in this larger flow. This, I think, is the basis of life, too. And when you get just oogles of complexity on that level, you get into humans, I guess. Animals, I mean, hell, plants. That's a beautiful, simple one that is super elegant. And yeah, you get into these different waveforms, and they carry story. And what is story here? Story is flow. Story is a relationship to time, a perspective in time, to a certain perspective in space. Perfect. And perspective here is a process. So you're looking at processes in space and time. That is a story. That is our weather. That is our sun. That is plants. That is our thoughts. That is the life we live. And I think I've rambled on long enough, and I'm definitely going to parse these out to create shorter videos going in more detail onto this stuff. And I'm excited to have my first video, second video, whatever it is, and talk to you soon. Thanks.